We're now going to get into Salim going deeper on digital medicine, synthetic biology. This is several talks when you're at Singularity, so he'll try and give you some really good overviews of some of the trends that are happening. You saw a glimpse of it in the opening keynote, but there's some unbelievable, impactful things happening in this space that can fundamentally change people's lives, so it's very exciting for us. And Salim, look forward to having you speak. Again, if you weren't here in the previous session, this is all about the questions. So Salim will give some discussion and some presentations, but we really want to get questions from the audience. And or Salim will actually start to ask you guys questions, and then it gets really tough. So we'll go from there, okay? Thanks. Salim?
All right.
Over to you.
Thank you, Terry. Thanks again for being here, and thanks for Brad for a great discussion. There was something I wanted to touch on. This whole idea of sentience and self-awareness, it's a very sticky topic because we simply don't have a definition or a test for that, right? I think I'm self-aware and you look like you're self-aware, so I attribute self-awareness to you, right? My wife does not think I'm very self-aware. And so it's hard to even get started when we don't have a definition or a test for it. And until we define that a little bit better, it's hard to get going. As Ray has mentioned very significantly, language is a very thin pipe to try and discuss something as rich as consciousness. So let me run through. I'm going to kind of touch on a bit of a smorgasbord on a couple of different areas. And I'm going to try as fast as possible to get to the Q&A because that's the most interesting part. We've gone through this stuff. We focus a lot on these grand challenges, and I was asked to touch on that this afternoon because we think for the first time ever, these accelerating technologies can apply directly to these grand challenges. And I'll give you an example. Some of you may be aware of Dean Kamen, who created the Segway. He's just invented something called the slingshot. How many of you are familiar with the slingshot? A few, not very many. Okay, so a slingshot, I wish I had a photograph of it, but you can look it up. It's the size of a small fridge, and you plug into one side anything wet. Sewage, seawater, arsenic-laden water, mud, doesn't matter. And he uses a centrifuge or a distillation process and a filtration process. Out the other side comes 100% pure injectable water. It runs on 10 light bulbs worth of power, right? And for the first time ever, we may have solved the clean water problem because you can now distribute. He's just signed a deal with Coke. We introduced the two of them. And Coke is going to distribute his machines around the world to deliver clean water anywhere in the world for about a penny a liter. Okay? Now, when you have clean water, you automatically also take out half of the world's infectious diseases. And so he may have single-handedly, using technology, solved one of the grandest challenges that we have in humanity. Because water is actually a distribution problem, not a scarcity problem. In the same way that solar energy is not a scarcity problem, it's a distribution problem. So we look at how can we leverage these technologies to deliver abundance to us in all of these different areas. I'll give you one example of how the kind of shifting that we try and get into. This is malaria, one of the biggest problems in the world today. We have 200,000 new malaria cases a day being developed and created and diagnosed around the world. And the problem that we have is we don't detect it. We don't detect it because it takes an expert in a lab counting a blood sample, counting up the malaria sites in a blood sample to see, literally hitting a counter to see how, whether a blood sample has malaria. Well, if you're doing this in the developing world, most of them go undiagnosed, the disease spreads, and we end up in a cyclical motion. Miguel, one of our alumni, looks at this, and he ends up working at the World Health Organization, comes across this problem and says, surely there's a better way of dealing with this. And the experts of the UN go, well, we need more experts, more labs, more equipment, right? That's the linear way of looking at this problem. And he says, surely there's a better way. He goes off and thinks about it a bit, comes up with a website you can go play with called Malaria Spot. And what you do there is you go there and you're presented with a blood sample, and it's a first-person shooter game where you shoot malaria parasites. You can see I've got a couple correct, a couple wrong there. And you shoot malaria parasites. He launched this in a month. 7,000 people in almost 100 countries identified 250 million malaria parasites. Total cost, zero. Right? That's the shift that we're trying to instigate. How do you go from a scarcity linear model thinking to a completely different paradigm shift in this? Now, to the UN's credit, they actually made him head of their malaria labs worldwide. So he's kind of rolling this out because you could apply this to all sorts of other diseases. It turns out also that if 13 people play the same blood sample, you get to 100% accuracy, and therefore you don't even need the experts. And so pretty profound outcome by just thinking about the problem a different way, applying a couple of these accelerations, imaging in this case, plus gamification, and then completely changing the problem space. And what we're trying to do is bring together the leading thinkers in the world in these fast-moving technologies, combine that with the most ambitious and accomplished next-generation leadership, point them at the biggest problems. We hope something interesting happens as you swirl that around. And we're seeing that explosion across all of these technologies, right? I'm going to mention 2 or 3 kind of really crazy Canadians that we have involved with Singularity. Moses Znaimer, I think many of you are familiar with, seriously crazy. He's actually the very first donor to Singularity ever. He stood up at the founding conference and said, that's it, you guys are great, I want to give you money. Andrew Fersman, he's from Vancouver. You can tell by the sunglasses, he doesn't live anywhere near here. Looks a bit weird. He's actually building a company doing quantum algorithms. He's building a front end to a quantum computer to make any quantum computer cloud interface, cloud computing interfaceable, right? And so pretty fascinating when you take a cloud computing interface and apply it to a quantum computer, what you'll be able to do with that. And quantum computing is one of those things that seems to work, but we kind of simply don't know how quite yet. And it requires a fair bit of alcohol to discuss, so we'll leave it till later to get into that if you're so interested. Moon Express, this is, again, Bob Richards, one of Peter's partners building out the International Space University. He's building a FedEx service to the moon. And you have to be a little crazy to do that, right? The reason is there's $1 billion of pent-up experiments wanting to get to the moon. And the technologies are now available that he and a small team can build a lunar lander. And he's competing for the Lunar X Prize. And he's the leading candidate in this world for that. So I wanted to just run through some of those to give you some sense of how, Canadians at an individual level are seriously crazy, right? But when you get them into groups and as a society, we tend to be really conservative, and that kind of thing drives me a little bit crazy. So let me cover a couple of these areas that we're seeing that we think really take this whole exponential technologies to a whole other level. Optogenetics. How many of you are familiar with optogenetics? It's a very new field. It's about 3 years old. It's the intersection of virology, optics, physics. What they've done here is they've genetically engineered a new type of neuron, a brain cell, that's light sensitive. So if you shine a light on it, the brain cell fires. So you can essentially have the brain cell fire or prohibit its firing using light. They've then used a virus to distribute the neuron in the localized part of the brain of a mouse. In this case, where compassion sits. This was actually funded by the Dalai Lama. Okay? So now you have these brain cells in the localized part of the brain where compassion sits. They plug an optical fiber into the head of the mouse, turn on the switch, light floods the cranial cavity, the mouse becomes uber compassionate. In the same way, you can make the mouse hungry, angry, tired, sad, turn left, turn right, etc. And essentially what we're talking about is mind control over the internet, right? So, those who are interested, it's open in the other. I'll wait till they announce. I feel like I'm in an airport all of a sudden. All right. This is pretty fascinating stuff, pretty scary, very Frankensteinian concepts at one level, right? On the other hand, this may be a real treatment path for Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, and it's already in mice. Because if you can configure specific neural circuits in a brain, pretty fascinating what you could do with it. Brad talked about one approach to try and model the brain, but what if you could directly interface with the brain in a completely new way? Now, it's kind of crazy, but we have an old word for this. The old word is marketing. If you're in marketing, then you're trying to condition somebody's brain that when they see a Coke, that they get thirsty, right? All we've done is information enabled it, and now we can apply modeling and correlation, et cetera, et cetera. Moving on to biotech and synthetic biology, I mentioned we're now turning biology into the new IT. And essentially, we're manipulating genetic code like we do software engineering. And when you can do that, some interesting things happen. This is a company in one of our portfolios that's called the Genome Compiler. Because if you look at raw DNA, it's looking at machine code. It's ones and zeros. It's not that useful. What these guys are doing is creating functional building blocks from it, so you can essentially compile the software in an easy way. And the analogy fits almost 100%. So you can essentially assemble new DNA designs using software and then send it off for printing. The DNA gets synthesized, and hey, presto, you have your thing. This is pretty incredible stuff, because you combine this with one other technology, and you can literally, they now have today desktop printers for DNA. You can essentially design your DNA and literally print it out at your desktop, rather than having to ship it off to some lab to be able to do that in the future. And what becomes possible when I can literally sit down at a machine, model something out in a new life form, and then take it to the next level. I didn't have time to get the image in there because the story is so new, but there's a new development in the DNA world. We do DNA manipulation, and DNA is formed of 4 molecules, A, T, C, and G. Over the last few days, we've just found out that there's a new paradigm for DNA synthesis where they found 2 additional letters. They've included that in the DNA sequence, so now your instruction set goes from 4 to 6. You go from base 4 to base 6, very powerful to be able to do that. And they've actually managed to get bacteria to replicate using this new DNA, which is completely synthetic, never been seen before in the world, right? And so this is kind of totally going a whole new level, and that just happened literally 2-3 days ago, so my slides are out of date. Moving on a little bit more into the biotech and biology world, we are, the human ecosystem, the human body has 10 trillion cells in it, right? And we measure that 10 trillion cells and the most complex ecosystem that we know in the universe with essentially 4 metrics: temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, maybe glucose levels, right? What happens if I could instrument every single one of my 10 trillion cells? What happens if I could know exactly what are the enzyme levels in my kidneys? What happens if I could have something to say, hey, you're about to drink that coffee, wait 10 minutes so I finish this other thing and it'll be much more effective in the coffee, right? What happens when we get to that? And we'll get to that very, very quickly. What we're also finding out now at another level is that although we have 10 trillion cells in the human body, in our gut we have about 2 pounds of bacteria that are 100 trillion number strong bacteria sets. So we have 10 trillion human cells and 100 trillion bacteria in our bodies. So what we really are is just a carrying bag for a bunch of bacteria. How does that feel? How does that feel your ego in that sense, right? Now, if you are at that level, they're finding out now that if we can now create a diagnosis and an understanding of what are the different populations of bacteria, what are the composition levels of the different bacteria populations, that's actually driving a huge amount of areas like diabetes, obesity, even cancer, etc. One of our companies, Microbiome, called Ubiome, launched a Kickstarter, or Indiegogo campaign that's most successful in history, and you can actually buy a kit, go and get your own sequence done of the bacteria in your gut, and they'll give you information about it. Because as we understand how that model works, and this is completely just brand new in the last couple of years, as we can apply all the data modeling that Brad talked about to this population of bacteria to see how they react, correlate the different sequencing of different species of bacteria that I may have in my gut compared to you, and compare the conditions, we're going to see some really interesting outcomes come out. We'll see how human we really are, right? Now the question becomes, who am I? Am I the bacteria or am I me? And who's me anyway? And you can actually get a pretty good level of what are the different sequences and different bacteria populations in your gut. And the most dramatic story I've seen in this is there was a guy who, this is a well-documented case, there was a guy who for 10 years has suffered very bad ear infections and resulting migraines. And he took antibiotics for 10 years and nothing would help this issue of having ear infections and migraines resulting from the bacteria that resulted. He read about the biome, looked into it a bit, and he realized he does not have earaches in the other ear. So he took a Q-tip, swabbed the one ear, put it in the other, and essentially transplanted the bacteria from one ear to the other. In 2 days, his ear infections disappeared, his migraines disappeared, they've never come back again. Right? Talk about a dramatic thing. Now they're taking it a step further, and you can actually, and hopefully this won't ruin your appetite, but you can actually get fecal transplants done. So you take a fecal matter from a healthy person, reverse it up into an unhealthy person, and it's seeming to cure all sorts of unbelievable things in the unhealthy person. Okay? So if you're interested in this domain, go look at the microbiome. There's some fascinating new work, and it's just taken the world of medicine and biotech to a whole other level and a whole other dimension, right? Because I love this quote from this doctor. It says, the complexity of modern American medicine unaids the, anyway, you can read the damn quote. I actually interviewed the head of Google Health on stage at a conference a couple of years ago and said, look, as a Canadian, I simply don't understand the American healthcare system. Please explain it to me. And he said, oh, it's not a problem. It's easy. Our system is designed to get you sick and keep you sick for as long as possible without killing you. because it's a profit-generating system, right? And I've held onto my Canadian passport really carefully ever since, because hell knows when I might need it or when somebody might need it. And this is the huge issue that the American system is struggling with, not just in healthcare, but actually across every single one of the societal domains in the US, whether it's environmental or energy, et cetera. We've had what's called regulatory capture. The decisions made by politicians are not driven for the interests of the population, but by the interests of the status quo. And the banking sector is an easy example of that. And it's actually, President Carter was led to say that we are not a functioning democracy today. Right? Pretty staggering for an ex-president to make a statement like that. And they're in a hell of a mess as a result. But medicine is in this world of dramatically transforming, and we talked a little bit about this morning. We're taking every single aspect of the medical world and digitizing it, right? Whether it's electronic health records or lab tests or vaccines, et cetera, we're literally digitizing every side of it. And we heard this morning that once you digitize something, it hops on that Moore's Law bandwagon and starts doubling. This is how you used to do a colonoscopy. It was a very unpleasant procedure, which I won't describe. Some of you may have gone through it. Today, you lie down in an MRI machine, you have an image done, and essentially it's all done digitally, and you can detect the colon or problem using image recognition, right? This is pretty staggering, and we're seeing kind of this transition happen across the board. There's a Dutch company that can take your use a sound mechanism and do sound echo analysis on your heart, on your arteries coming out of your heart, and they can give you a very accurate diagnosis of what is the artery, the thickness of how blocked your arteries are just by the sound. How many of you are familiar with the quantified self movement? Okay, a few of you. So Kevin Kelly, the founder of Wired magazine, looked at this problem that we have 10 trillion cells in 4 metrics and said, why don't we instrument the hell out of everything that we can around the human body? So he started the quantified self movement, which essentially says, let's take every measurement that I can possibly find about the body. Whether I wear a Fitbit so I can track how many calories and steps, whether it's a Nike fuel band, whether it's constant temperature or heart rate readings. Because if you have that ongoing data stream, and let's say I have 10 different measurements coming out, as I correlate those data streams with each other and with other people, interesting patterns might emerge, right? Many of you may have heard the Google flu trends idea, where they actually can predict the outbreak of a flu to some extent by just seeing how many people are searching for those symptoms, and they've been able to successfully predict certain flu outbreaks. But essentially this paradigm is what we see exploding, where the miniaturization, the fact that we can take computation and sensing down to very small levels, embedded all over the place, and then extract the data, digitize it, and then start doing analysis using machine learning, deep learning algorithms, et cetera, right? Some fascinating things will come out of that. Your mirror will soon tell you, hey, don't eat that dessert. You know, you're not quite ready, you're gaining too much weight, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, my wife tells me that, but soon we'll have our mirrors doing that. Brad mentioned the Tricorder X Prize. This is pretty fascinating. A $10 million prize for the first handheld that will do automatic diagnosis that will outperform 10 board-certified doctors. They expect to give the prize out by the end of this year. So by the end of this year, we might have a handheld diagnostic device that outperforms most doctors, right? Because if you go to the doctor today, you get the wrong diagnosis about 35% of the time, right? So for the 3 of you, as Brad mentioned, one of you, the last time you went to the doctor, got the wrong diagnosis. I want to have a chat about who that might be, right? And for the poor doctors, how do you keep up with all of the treatments, symptoms, drugs, et cetera, as we can automate this and digitize it to this level. And of course, this will be incredibly valuable in developing countries where we have like 1 doctor per 2 million citizens, et cetera, et cetera. This is maybe the most interesting development in medicine that we're seeing right now. This is a set of apps in the App Store for eyes. Okay? So today we're starting to, instead of prescribing you a drug, we're going to prescribe an app to you. Okay? And that's happening more and more because we've gone from antibiotics and vaccinations to genomics and now to digital and mobile health. And we're using this digital phenomena and the ability to analyze what's going on to provide a whole new level of that, whether it's my sequencing my genome and seeing what's happening at a 23andMe level, or some of the more esoteric things going on. It led Vinod Khosla, who I mentioned this morning, it led him to say that he made this prediction that 80% of what doctors do today will be replaced by technology within 10 years. 80%. That's a pretty old industry, right? So pretty staggering to see what might happen there and how will we deal with it. Today, if you do a medical degree in most countries, you get about 1 hour of genomics training in that 7 years that you're in medical school. And yet today we know that a lot of our healthcare and our dosages for drugs could be customized based on what my genome sequence looks like. Which brings about a whole other structural issue, which is as we customize dosages and drugs for the individual, how do you do clinical trials if your sample size is 1, right? And so we have to create entirely new mechanisms. And we mentioned what we were doing in education, which is a completely different approach. We're going to have to do completely different approaches to clinical trials because we simply doesn't apply, the paradigm doesn't apply as we try and do personalized medicine. This is one of our companies called Scanadu. It's the leading contender for the X Prize tricorder thing. And you can see the device. That's an entire medical examination room in a little box the size of 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters. Right? An entire doctor's medical examination room. So this is happening very, very quickly. Let me cover a few slides of where we think this is going, and then I'll open it up to questions because that's the more interesting part. We talked a little bit this morning about the negative sides of this and the danger side of it. This is Mark Goodman, our head of policy, law, and ethics. He wrote a cover story for Wired talking about biocrime. He wrote an article for the Atlantic Monthly, which was the cover story about 18 months ago, called Hacking the President's DNA. Because I could actually design today, in my bedroom, a virus or a bacteria designed to attack one DNA signature, use a common cold to hop across people, and then when it found that DNA signature, do something nasty. And you could do that today. Now today, what they're doing is the CIA will, after the president or the prime minister has left something, they'll try and sweep up and clean up so this DNA is not left behind. But that's actually not a workable solution because any basketball that he ever held as a child would have his DNA still on it, or any chair that he ever sat on, or any clothes that he ever wore. So it's not really that protectable as a sense, right? And as Brad mentioned, we can go back through time, and as the technologies get powerful, we can go back and analyze things through time. How will we deal with that as a society? And that's maybe one of the concept of bioterrorism, intentional or accidental outcomes in biotech, or maybe one of the biggest concerns that we have as a faculty and as Singularity. Because we're literally digitizing every single thing that we can find, and when you can digitize it, you can analyze it. This is a company out of Israel called Beyond Verbal. They've looked at 60,000 different subjects, and what they can do is they can take a 10-second clip of your voice, and with a 10-second clip, they can tell you what is your mood and what is your underlying attitude on like 400 different categories, metrics. Right? Some of you may have seen this video of this guy annoyed at his daughter on Facebook because it went pretty viral. And they're actually analyzing his voice, and they can show he's really militant, and his underlying attitude is vain arrogance, and it goes like that. They actually analyzed Mitt Romney's 47% statement and saw that. You can actually download an app on the App Store called Moody's that will give you, if you listen to a 10-second clip of your own voice, what is your voice and your underlying attitude, right? Pretty cool to be able to do that. We're advising the mayor of Barcelona. We did a workshop with them on, hey, they've got 60% unemployment if you're below 30 years old in Spain. It's an absolutely massive issue there. And he's trying to figure out how does he handle the city. And one of the ideas that came out was put a microphone in all the public squares and analyze people's voices so you could get literally a live heat map of what the happiness index and the mood index of the entire city. Right? Pretty interesting there, or in an airport, and so on. Okay? And you can see the mood and the underlying attitude done there. Okay? Right now what's happening is, and this is some of Brad's work, is today governments are using these technologies with impunity to spy on the population. Right? That's what's happening and what's been happening over the last decade or so. But little by little, we're going to start shifting it around. Okay? And little by little, via transparency, we're going to be able to start holding a little more accountability around some of this stuff. This is in Grenada. Every policeman wears their Twitter handle on their sleeve. Right? Pretty amazing and courageous thing to do on a public perception level. And this is the videos of the Russian meteor, the meteor that hit Russia last year. Right? Remember the meteorite that hit Siberia? There's like about 100 and odd live recordings of that 2-second clip. Okay? And so somebody asked, why are there so many people who were able to trap that 2-second clip live? How are they able to do that? And it turns out that the reason is that most Russians in their cars have dashboard cameras. And so many people just flip the dashboard camera on and were able to record through their windscreens the meteor hitting. So then people ask, why do all the Russians have dashboard cameras? And it turns out that because it's a bit of the Wild West and there's no real rule of law, if there's a corrupt policeman or if somebody crashes into you for accident insurance fraud, a lot of them have dashboard cameras to be able to record what happened and protect themselves. And so they've learned how to use technology, and we love this as a kind of a leading indicator to say, hey, here's what's going on. I'm recording what's going around me via Google Glass or via a dashboard camera in this sense as to how we're going to deal with this new future as we go forward. Right? I'll make a couple of predictions as we close this out. The first is that with all of this video recognition, emotional processing, facial recognition, thermal sensing, etc., I predict that within 5 years, it will be impossible to lie. Right? So our politicians might have an interesting time, especially in the US, about how to deal with this. But what will the world look like? How will society function if I can instantly tell that somebody's lying? Right? Or if somebody's stressed and I get a false positive around that. And I think that it's a lie. And then maybe this is the most extreme one. There's a concept in the aging world called escape velocity. Because we've been steadily increasing lifespan over the last few hundred years. If you went back 1,000 years, average lifespan was less than 30 years old. Even in about 1900, average lifespan was about 42, 43. Now it's 80, right? And we have figured out what are the mechanisms that govern aging, and we figured out also how to reverse it. And so as people are experimenting with this stuff, the concept in the aging world is called escape velocity, right? That for every calendar year that goes by with gene therapies, stem cell therapies, regenerative medicine, organ transplants, God knows what, we'll have figured out for every calendar year that goes by how to add more than a year to your life. So when we hit that point in time, we'll have people that can live for an arbitrarily long period of time. Our assessment of that situation is not a question of if, it's a question of when. And that point in time seems to be between 18 to 20 years away. Right? So in our lifetimes, for many of us, that will happen for good or bad. What do we do with pension plans, retirement planning, employment benefits, healthcare costs, right? For many religions, their business model is that they're selling an afterlife, right? What happens to religion's business model when this happens? So all sorts of huge societal questions will be asked and answered literally in these next few years, and we as a society have to figure out how to deal with it. And I'll pause there because I can go into how companies are dealing with this or not, but we can get into that later. Let me pause there, see if there's any questions, because I think the Q&A and discussions are much more interesting. We covered a few different topics, so if there's any questions around them.
All right, folks, now's the chance to ask those tough ones.
There's a mic there, go grab it.
There's a microphone so everybody can hear you, so please step up.
Can you say something about food?
Close to the mic.
Can you say something about food production and consumption? And
food production, consumption, et cetera, et cetera. How many of you are worried about overpopulation? Okay, got it. We are not, and I'll explain why. Overpopulation in food production, food consumption is a very direct correlation to economic prosperity, right? And if you look at the UN just reported that over the last 30 years, we've dropped extreme poverty by over 80% around the world. That's a staggering outcome, that over 80% of extreme poverty has been wiped out in the last 30 years. And when people go from extreme poverty to poverty, the birth rate drops dramatically, right? And our estimates indicate we'll peak out at about 9 billion in about 2050, and then the population actually starts dropping. Japan is suffering this issue today. They literally can't, there's not enough kids to actually do the next generation's work. Now, when we're going from 7 billion to 9 billion, from our doubling perspective, that's not even one doubling, right? And if our food production, which has been steadily increasing over the years, we don't have to go that much further to get to that level. So we're very optimistic about resources and food production and population, and very optimistic about energy. I mentioned solar energy and the fact that solar energy is actually the price performance of photovoltaics is actually on an exponential curve because it's driven by information today. It's doubling in its price performance every 22 months today, and has been for quite a while if you saw my graph from earlier. At that pace, we will hit 100% of world energy supply delivered by solar in less than 25 years. Right? So that will have a pretty profound impact. More importantly, in 27 years, we hit 200%. In 29 years, we hit 400%. Because that doubling just keeps going. Okay? Because if you add up all of the fossil fuels we have in the world, all of the coal, the oil, the natural gas, and you add up all of the energy in that, it literally adds up to 5 days of sunlight hitting the world. And that shifts the conversation completely from a scarcity problem to a conversion problem. And that conversion is now on that doubling pattern. And so we're very optimistic about energy, because when you have clean energy, you can have lots of other things as well, right? Food production becomes easier. And if you want to think about food production, the most interesting thing to go look at is Soylent. How many of you are familiar with Soylent? So this kid out of New York, I think New York, maybe Baltimore, somewhere there, created this stuff called, like a protein powder called Soylent. And what he did was he went and analyzed what does a human being need in terms of nutrients, vitamins, minerals, et cetera, what's the perfect supplement set for an entire person. And he created a powder, which will initially be used to supplement where we don't have meals 3 times a day or something like that, or if you're traveling and you need it. He's created a powder. People have now lived on it for over a month, just consuming that, and it's working out fantastically well. And there's now he's open sourced the ingredients, and now there's about 1,400 variants on people are doing on different things, right? Because if you can get the raw nutrients and figure out how to encapsulate those, and you can remove the need for food production and farming, et cetera. So there's a bunch of different vectors that lead us to be very optimistic about food production, including biotech, which has some scary actors in it, like Monsanto, which are the bad actors in the thing. But for example, we're feeding the world today because of genetically modified foods, right? We have served 1 trillion meals around the world with GMOs with no discernible public health problem. And so something is going okay there. Again, it's hard to do longitudinal testing on some of these issues because the environment's changing so quickly. For example, we're now getting also into vertical farming and drip feeding plants down the sides of walls, because then you can use water much more effectively and so on. 7% of the vegetables in Singapore today are already vertically farmed. 7%. It's a pretty amazing number, right? And so a combination of all of these factors leads us to be very optimistic around food production and population and energy in general. We're pretty optimistic about the world overall. We think the next decade is the tricky part. We have to figure out how to move all our old structures into new structures. But overall, we're very positive and very optimistic. Okay? Any other questions?
Yeah, Salim, we'll get one there. Come on up to the mic. But I was speaking with Dr. Ann Snowden, who's doing a bunch of the interesting research in e-health in Canada. And we were talking about some of the new hospitals that are coming on, digitally enabled, et cetera, and taking advantage of AI and deep learning, et cetera. And she said the fundamental problem that we really haven't solved yet is the preventative side, as opposed to detection and actually resolution after. Can you talk about where you see that side of the space going?
The prevention side, a huge chunk of that is knowledge, right? And so as we have knowledge that's available, say for somebody goes and creates a thing called Soylent, and we can do some self-reporting on it. If you have metrics and instrumentation on your body saying what's happening, and I'm beaming that out to the world, and we can correlate that with other people, there's all sorts of interesting things. 2 Canadians created a website called Cure Together. Was it Cure Together? Patients Like Me? One of the two. Cure Together, right? And they've essentially correlating symptoms and treatments that different people are trying based on different conditions. If my left toe turned blue, then what did I do and what worked? And if 20,000 people all see that this worked, you can apply that
so
at a large level.
Leveraging the data of the crowd.
Leveraging the data of the crowd and crowdsourcing a lot of that is one profound thing. And I thought His Excellency's comments this morning were really interesting around Genghis Khan. That was the old way of distributing knowledge, which was to conquer things. Now we have the internet, and it's a little bit easier to disseminate knowledge than having to conquer an entire continent to do it. And we have that ability now to see exactly what's happening around the world and who's working on what tests. One big failing we have had is the science community. Weirdly, the practice of science is still stuck in the Middle Ages, right? Today, to get accepted, if you want to publish a scientific paper, you try and demonstrate some results, and only the most prestigious papers will, you want to get in the prestigious things, and there's a paywall behind it, and it's literally like the old models of publishing that need to be, and we're now moving to much more open models of science, so that if I'm doing an experiment, I should be publishing my negative results as well as my positive results. Today, like 90% of negative results don't get published. And so we have a huge amount of wasted time as different people try the same thing and find out the same problem. If we can start sharing that, and now we're moving to that point where the scientific community has finally woken up and said, okay, I had a negative result, let me publish that as well, and share that for the benefit of the bigger good. Let's see. And there you go. Very nice. Keep your seatbelts fastened because there's a bumpy ride coming on. Other questions? Yeah.
So everything you've been saying.
Come close to the mic.
Everything you've been saying is very thought-provoking, and every time you say something new, I honestly think of another question. So first, I'm going to ask a question. You talked about solar, and you're very excited about the opportunities for it. But doesn't solar use a lot of natural resources? And how are we going to come up? Like, what if we run out of those natural resources that solar power requires? Yeah, good question. So the question was, doesn't solar use a lot of natural resources, and is that prohibitive, et cetera? Okay, I'll take you back to 1984 when McKinsey's, I used the example of mobile phones this afternoon, right? McKinsey's was the most extreme prediction in this area. They were advising AT&T on this. Hang on, I'm just going to skip through a couple of things here. I actually wanted to show something on this, but hang on. McKinsey's wrote a report, and they made a prediction that in 1984 that said that the global market for mobile phones would never exceed 1 million units. Okay? And they advised AT&T to leave the business, and AT&T left the mobile phone business at hundreds of billions of dollars cost later, had to buy back into it. Okay? And we actually had one of the co-authors of the report in one of our executive programs, and he put his hand up and said, "Yep, that was us." Right? He said, "Wow, well, you know, what were you thinking? How did you?" And he goes, "Totally made a huge mistake." And the reason was that our predictions were based on mobile phones keeping the same resource footprint and framing in the profile that the mobile. When you had that big battery briefcase, a briefcase of a battery, and you had this big clunky handset, you weren't going to sell more than 1 million of those. What they missed was that they were shrinking 50% in size per year, and within a few years you had a clamshell. And yes, you could sell a ton more of those, right? And actually the head of Frost & Sullivan, one of the leading research firms, I was talking to him to confirm some of the details that I got from Vinod around the mobile phone predictions. And he made the point that, you know, when you have an exponential curve, if you miss one step, you're off by 50%. So it's really easy to get the wrong estimates on an exponential curve. So when we think about food production or when we think about energy, we think that solar is using the same materials and we'll be stuck using the same materials for the next 10, 20, 30 years. What's actually happening is we're changing what we're doing with solar energy and what we're using to trap it very, very dramatically. And some of the material science guys and we're using nano antennas to collect solar. We're using graphene. There's all sorts of fascinating new things happen. Our prediction is that trend continues even faster than we think it will. Okay, any other questions? Yep, over here. Okay, why don't you go first? Ladies first. Go ahead.
Earlier today you were talking about the ability for technology to unfortunately take away the need for people.
Yes.
And just now, thankfully, you expanded on the fact that we shouldn't technically be worried about an increased population because we could have the resources to support said population, which is fantastic. But what need will society have to have that increased population if we're taking away those jobs right from under our feet? And with that, can you elaborate or touch upon how or what you think how laws will change in order to, or even the model that society has will change in order to support that?
So the model that society, so we've relied on, so there's about 6 different questions in there, right? If I narrow it down, one is how do we deal with in society with people whose jobs disappear?
People, but the ability to live longer.
Yeah. So the simple answer is we don't know. Okay. We can make some approximations. So I'll give you a couple of those. One is if you went back 500 years, we spent 18 hours a day working in the fields so that we could just put 3 meals on the table. Right? And the amount of time that we've been devoting to work to earn a sustainable living out of it has been shrinking. In France, it's 35 hours a week legally mandated now, right? They have a 35-hour work week in theory in France. And so we've actually been shrinking the amount of time that we need to work to actually maintain a living. That's an important point, because productivity has been growing up. We have a massive distribution problem because the wealth distribution is a mess. We don't know how to deal with that quite yet. But we have this view that there's a zero-sum situation, that if you take away somebody's work, that they won't have anything else to do, right? And I'll give you the analogy. If you go back 100 years in the US, in 1900, about 50% of the workforce was agriculture, right? Today it's 1.8%. And it's not like 53% are out of work. We found other jobs for them, like web designer, accountant, et cetera, et cetera. What's happening now that's unique is that the metabolism is accelerating. The life cycle of a new job is actually moving very quickly. Maybe most extreme in the web development world. If you're a web developer, you almost need to reinvent yourself almost on a yearly basis to keep pace with the pace of change. John Seeley Brown, who's one of the thought leaders at Deloitte, made this comment. He ran Xerox PARC for a couple of decades, and he made this observation that the half-life of a skill used to be about 30 years. You could learn how to be a master welder, and that would last you most of your lifetime. That 30-year half-life of a skill is now down to about 5 years. Right? So we need a new mechanism to constantly update our skills. And most of you, if you think about your work is fundamentally transformed over the last 2 to 3 years, and you're doing it completely differently, right? That trend just continues. You just completely we're redoing how we do things, and without realizing, we're changing the macro level at the same time. And so industries are shaping very drastically. I'll use the example in 2005, a whole new industry sprang up in the marketing world called social media analyst, right? And people were creating like clipping services of social media, and whole consulting companies and experts around the world got created around this. By 2009, we had algorithms to automate all of that, and an entire industry and job description came up, became big, and then disappeared in 4 years, right? And now we have subscription services, mostly free, around this. And I didn't go through the slides earlier, but it's part of that demonetization. Okay? Now the mistake, the other side of the coin also, is that the jobs that we are replacing with robotics or with AIs or however are usually types of jobs that we don't want to be doing in the first place. Okay? If I'm doing a stock picking thing, I'm doing it because I have to do it, not because I choose to do it. What we'll have increasingly is more choice as to what we do. And the question is, how do you develop that choice? And how do you then go act on it? And that's where we focus on grand challenges. Part of our mission statement and the underlying understated objective is, if we can infect a young future leader by thinking about a big problem, they can't go back to thinking about a small problem. None of our alumni is going to go, after thinking about how do you solve hunger for 1 billion people around the world, they're not going to go think about how do I build a better mobile ad network for the iPhone 5S version for 6 months, right? And so we're trying to kind of infect them literally, without saying that. Don't tweet that, if you don't mind. Anyway, so we are seeing very fundamental changes. We don't know what the future looks like because the metabolism is moving so fast. We tend to be very optimistic. For example, human creativity and design skills, taking patterns of reference from one area and applying them to another, the kind of the raw definitions of intelligence, are still something that are very far away from a AI or robotics perspective. Raw basic analysis, easily done. And then even in the data side, we are using machine learning and deep learning algorithms to do things that we fundamentally couldn't even do for human beings. Let me make it a little bit more tangible. If you're running a business, if you're a senior leader in a business, you're there because you have supposedly some intuitive insights about how that business is run, right? And then some new situation presents itself, and you use your experience to apply to that new situation and go, that's how we should do things. And that's why you're in that position. We had Jeremy Howard, who was one of our faculty. He was graded for 2 years in a row the leading data scientist in the world. So you want to talk about geek, that's the guy, right? We sent him into one of the big 3 mobile telcos in the US, and you can guess which brand names are. And he spent 1 day running machine learning algorithms against their churn thing. If you're in the mobile phone business, you want to minimize churn, new customers signing up and then leaving you because customer acquisition costs are so high. In 1 day of running his algorithms, he identified $1.8 billion of instantly recoverable savings because the machine learning algorithm is looking at 6 million different correlated variables, whereas we're looking at 1 or 2 and basing it on experience, right? And so by running so many different models and running them effectively and modeling it out, you can actually get really, we said to them, we hope you operate it on a percentage basis, not on a fixed fee for that day. But that's kind of some of the results were happening. So I think what we'll see is we'll automate a certain class of work as well as manufacturing, mostly the labor-intensive stuff that we don't want to do. And then we'll unleash all sorts of creative potential. Because if we could have 1 million people around the world doing interesting things, like the Soylent guy, right? Or how many of you are familiar with Jack Andreka, the kid in the US who did pancreatic cancer? Let me see if I have this thing here. Hang on, I may have this. Hang on, I have it. Bear with me.
Well, Salim looks for that. I mean, what you got is a glimpse of what goes on at the Innovation Partnership Program. What's amazing is they bring the exponential technologies plus the exponential business models, but then the discussion becomes, just because we can automate, just because we can put in robots or use AI, should we? And what does it mean in terms of policy changes for governments? What does it mean in terms of how you run your corporations? What does it actually mean? Some of the research, Salim, that you're doing is, what does it mean to the actual nature of an organization? Yeah. So are they going to get smaller rather than bigger, and how do you leverage? So all of those kind of aspects spin out of these conversations, which makes it such exciting brain candy, but also so difficult to get your hand around.
This hits the whole medical world, etc. Let me tell this little story. Jack Andreka 3 years ago is 14 years old. Family friend dies of pancreatic cancer, right? And we have a huge issue with pancreatic cancer today because we do not have early stage detection of it. We diagnose this in stage 4 often, and then you have 98% mortality. He gets very upset about this. He's very close to this family figure. He's driven to find a solution, and he says, why is there not an early stage detection test? He looks through the research and finds that no researchers have found that. He starts finding some clinical trials and starts browsing through some clinical trials that are available on Google and comes across a particular protein, a biomarker that might indicate early stage pancreatic cancer. He then does a bunch more searches saying, how could I find this biomarker early, and finds that carbon nanotubes, a new substance, would be really good, might be really good at detecting this particular biomarker. Writes a 5-page paper, sends it to the top 200 cancer researchers in the US, and says, can I test out my hypothesis in your labs? Because I may have something here. The vast majority of them look at this paper and go, the kid's 14. He doesn't have a medical degree. He's not even finished. He's just starting high school. He can't possibly figure this out, right? I probably would have done the same thing, okay? And most of us would have done the same thing. One of them, Johns Hopkins, because he lived nearby, said, oh, let's have him come in, told one of their researchers, look, talk to him, and probably he's not going to work, but chat with him for a bit. The guy talks to him for half an hour, brings in everybody else, they spend the day with him, they gave him 5 months of lab space, and he turns out that he might be correct. His work still needs to be peer reviewed and so on. There's a little more complexity to it. But this 14-year-old kid may have single-handedly flipped the switch from 98% mortality to 98% survival. And he did it by searching Google, right? That's what we want to unleash. We'd much rather have that brain thinking about that than doing an assembly line. And the question is, how quickly can we shift society to this model, right? And it's going to happen anyway, because one other point around these exponential technologies, which is really, really important, is there is no slowing them down. Once something hits that exponential, it keeps going no matter what. George Bush, for ideological reasons, tried to restrict stem cell research in the US. All the researchers went to China, came here to Canada. Stem cell research continued exactly at pace. The US just got left behind 6 or 8 years. And so you cannot slow these down. Your only hope is to stay on top of it and be at that cutting edge and surf that wave in a sense, and take advantage of it. And maybe, given the power of these technologies, how amazing is the potential from our perspective, right? Other questions, yeah.
She literally asked my question, but I have another one.
Okay.
So you've spoken a lot about the crazy Canucks that are down in the US.
Yeah.
We've seen Elon Musk did live here. He now lives
yeah.
in the US. Jeff Skoll is another one who now lives in the US. We have one of the best rates of education in the world,
yeah.
If you compare us internationally. How do we keep that here? How do we bring people back? What can Canada do to avoid the fact that we might not need to be a resource economy in the future? How can we place ourselves?
I think I would even make it stronger. You're saying might not need to be. That's very polite. I would say you're. Yeah, I got it. I am too. I've somehow lost my politeness over the years. I think that what we'll find over the next few years is that Canada will have to shift its resource base in the next. There's a segment tonight on Lang and O'Leary, the TV show. So I made that comment on the TV show saying, in 10 years, Canada's economy is fundamentally disrupted off this resource-based environment. And so it won't appear right now, but in the next 2-3 years, it'll start becoming apparent and we'll have to shift. Our hope is that the earlier we can shift, the better, okay? There's 2 or 3 things that can be done. First is, one of the things that Canada is really good at is the social engineering, the social motivations to spur entrepreneurship. But at the same time, it makes us much more cautious about things, because if you're in public office or you're responsible for the Health Innovation Fund for Edmonton or whatever, you have to be much more buttoned down because of transparency. You can't take risks in your job, all of that stuff. And so we tend to be very risk averse, and we should be actually jumping forward into risk. That's the kind of risk that you can take on today with really no consequence. It just comes down to sheer mentality. Here's what I would do, and I'd be happy to partner with anybody here, and we would be happy to do it if it's interesting. You need to change the cultural mindset to taking risk, right? Because here, if you take a big risk and you fail, you are a failure, right? Silicon Valley is unique because if I take a big risk and I fail, we call it experience, right? I've failed enough times that I couldn't survive here. I literally, if I showed up here and said, hey, I want to do something, people go, wow, he's failed those 2-3 times, et cetera, et cetera. Even in the East Coast of the US, I've failed a couple of times there, and I'm a disaster there. I go to Silicon Valley, I'm a hero, right? Naturally happy to be there, et cetera. But fundamentally, because here's how we think about it. When a child is learning to play the piano the first time and sits down and plays, they're terrible. We don't say to the child, you're terrible, don't ever play the piano again, right? Yet when they're building a business the first time and they fail, we say, don't ever build another business again. And we stigmatize them. In fact, what we should be saying is go do it again, practice harder. And if you talk to any successful CEO in Silicon Valley, they have their litany of failures and then until they have their big success, right? And so the question is, how can you then culturally reward failure and encourage more risk taking? Here's what I would suggest. What I would suggest is work with Discovery, work with Deloitte, work with us, whoever. Let's create a contest annually, semi-annually, whatever, where we look at the 3 entrepreneurs around Canada that took the biggest risk, okay? Put them on stage, give them a huge prize, put them on TV. Reward the attempt, right? As long as there's no theft or whatever, and, you know, on it. And there's all sorts of people doing that. And the reason that some of us Canadians go down to the US or wherever is because we can't do that here. It's much easier to do it in the US and much easier to do it in another order of magnitude in Silicon Valley. But you could change the cultural mindset. The number 2 the entrepreneurship ecosystem is Israel, because they live with existential threat. So taking a risk to them is not a big deal compared to what they live with all the time. So it's more easily acceptable, and they're able to do it to another level, right? And so those are the couple of ways we could think about it. But I think it's critical to shift the mentality of taking risk, which is why I made the comment earlier today of if you're kind of in a public position, for God's sakes, enable more risk-taking from people.
Yeah,
I mean, when I was here in the 90s, I was trying to raise venture capital, and it was an oxymoron. They didn't actually want to venture the capital. And I said, but that's your job description. Venture the capital. Where's the venture part, right? And so you'd go crazy trying to do that. It's much better now. $4 billion raised in the first quarter, fantastic, but a lot more. I think it needs to go like literally a 10x level to another order of magnitude.
We're doing a lot of research on the whole productivity and innovation agenda and trying to demystify some of those areas. And in fact, the report that's coming out in the next month looks at that risk paradigm. And Canadian companies think, I'm going to stay here, it's safe. I'm going to stay in my province, stay in the country, I'll sell here, and it's less risky. And the reality is there's a lot higher failure rate if you don't go outside the country. So a lot more research on failure around taking on practical risk and getting on with it that needs to be done.
And here's the opportunity. Let me just take a couple of minutes. If you look at, all new business models and new industries today are now information-based, right? Google 10 years ago was a bit of a joke. They didn't know how they were going to make money. Now, a $300 billion company essentially by manipulating text and now video, right? Facebook, $160 billion company just by digitizing our relationships. This is where the opportunity is. How do you think about that future in today's world? Because we are digitizing everything. Okay?
I think we got time for one more here.
Go ahead.
So you're talking a lot about today's entrepreneurs. What about tomorrow's entrepreneurs? Like you said before that you have a daughter who's 3.
Son.
Okay, a son, sorry, a child. Do you put him in front of technology right now? What are the skill sets? Like, what types of training do you think needs for the next generation of entrepreneurs, as well as people for manipulating and working with technology?
That's my question.
So I think there's about three things there, the three elements to thinking about that. The first is our current educational system simply doesn't measure up. Our education system today is what I would call a push system. You get kids into a classroom, you try and shove algebra into them, right? Mostly they're thinking about lunch. Right? And the retention levels are very, very poor. Okay? I showed you that focus at will idea where you play music. They found that if a kid studies with that, their retention level goes up 5 times just by listening to music and playing. Right? So we know so much more about neural retention, pedagogical techniques, etc., and we have not updated our techniques. And our education system was designed to produce workers for the industrial age. And we're now in a knowledge age. And the way we need to do it is shift from the current way we do things to teaching what's known as 21st century skills, okay? Which is problem solving, collaboration, community, communication, critical thinking, etc. We have to have creativity. We have to have courses that, well, some of our lectures at Singularity are about critical thinking because we find most of the incoming students, even though they're master's degrees and PhDs, have not had even the basics of critical thinking to evaluate options and to do critical reasoning down at the basic level. So if you do what's called the 6 C's or what's called 21st century skills, that provides a platform, and there's lots of schooling systems that are looking at that pretty heavily. And then the second part of it is you inspire the child to find a big problem space. And this is why we look at the grand challenges. But if you take young kids, they're all interested in a particular problem space. More interesting to point them towards a problem space than a particular technology. Because a technology may or may not end up in a particular problem space. But if you have a problem space, you can apply many technologies to it. So we find it's more interesting to try and get a child, rather than getting inspired about robotics, think about what's the problem you're trying to solve, and then bring to bear whatever technologies will work to solve that problem. And so when you can do that, you end up, well, what we'd like to do is how can we enable 10 million Jack Andrekas around the world? How can the schooling system, and I think we'll move from educational systems to learning systems. And our concern in our current projection is you cannot fix the existing education system. Certainly in the US, it's not fixable. It's too wired into regulatory, it's too many vested interests, you've got the teachers' unions, you've got lobbying efforts, it's too much of a mess. What needs to happen is people will build new systems at the edges, like the Khan Academy. Right? How many of you are familiar with the Khan Academy? Okay, many of you, good. So look up the Khan Academy, K-H-A-N, if you're interested, where people can pull down modules of learning as they need to. Today we don't teach facts very much because you can pull it down from Wikipedia or Google as you need to. As we can pull down modules of learning, then we can essentially do just-in-time learning for a particular problem space we choose to attack at that point in time. And that may be the vector forward. The most inspiring model I've seen is what's called democratic education. So there's a school going on with classes with multiple age kids going on across different subjects. A 6-year-old or 7-year-old shows up at school and they ask, the first thing they say is, what do you want to do with your life? And the child says, I want to be an astronaut. Great. Here you need to learn about astronomy, you need to learn about science, you need to learn about physics, team building, safety mechanisms, etc. And a curriculum is created based on what the child says they want to do. 6 months later, if the child says, hey, I want to be a fireman, great, now you need to know chemistry, you need to know pyrotechnics, and you literally readapt and you constantly tweak, and it keeps the child's interests, the parents' interests aligned. You've got kids teaching each other, so that's the best form of learning, is older kids teaching younger kids. And that's maybe the most advanced model that we've seen. It's been running for about 15 years pretty successfully. So that's kind of how we think it works. But you cannot fix the existing systems. Right? I'm writing a book right now on the future of organizational structures, and I've noticed that you can't take an existing big company and turn it into this new animal. You literally have to build new things along the edges that inspire where the future goes. All right? I think we're running out of time.
Yeah, I think we're there. Salim, thank you so much. And here a little hand first thing.
Thank you. And for Brad as well.
And Brad, I will tell you, as having attended the session, this material actually changes how you think about the world. So feel free to get on singularityU.org. We've got some stuff on our site, and I think it's Deloitte.Presley.com that has exponentials and some of the ongoing research that we're doing in that area. This changes how you think about education. We just drifted into that topic. It changes how you think about solutions for your organizations. Hopefully changes and ignites the Canadian entrepreneurial spirit. The reason we brought Brad and Salim up in February to deal with CEOs is we want to actually ignite the Canadian entrepreneurial spirit and change the trajectory, which is not going in the right direction in terms of our productivity agenda in the country. So take that on. Salim, I do have a question for you though. Is there any way that we could accelerate the lie detector test? Because we've got a little mayoral race going on. That if we could sort that out, I think it would be very beneficial.
You know, I have to tell you that...
Maybe in the next 2 months, could you do that?
I have to tell you, living south of the border, the whole Rob Ford thing, people think this is
We're not naming names here.
No, I'm just saying, people are going, wow, Toronto must be really cool to be able to accept a mayor like that. What a great city. So it's actually a much more positive brand image than you would possibly think about.
Maybe in California. Maybe in California,
pretty much everywhere around the world.
The bad news is the most famous Canadians now are Rob Ford and Justin Bieber.
Yeah, exactly. Brad, can you come up for a moment? We've got a gift for each of you.
Okay.
So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is, and I don't know if we have somebody from the conference here. There's a meet and greet and reception out here.
Yeah, if you have further questions, we'll be hanging around and we'll be at the meet and greet if you have more detailed questions. But I would urge you, don't just sit and listen to this. Please go do something with this thinking. For us, it's not, we don't want, education is not the biggest thing. We hope that somebody takes action. Go yell at your elected representatives, change your school board. We've released about 30 or 40 of our lectures online for free on our YouTube channel. Go tell your kids to watch them, do whatever, but do something with this because we are at an inflection point. And I think Canada has a really critical role to play, as I mentioned this afternoon, more so than most other countries that I've been able to see. Right?
Yeah, so, this is the right switched on audience. Now you guys have to each go and influence 100 people outside that aren't as switched on as you are. So
forget 100, 1 billion.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, no pressure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks.